Well, welcome to episode 367 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Ron Carter from 1974 on CTI All Blues. And this is a first US pressing from that same year. Few musicians navigated the choppy waters between the modal jazz and hard bop of the 1960s to the funkier sounds of the 1970s more deftly than Ron Carter, living legend, educator, innovator, and the most recorded jazz bassist in the history of the known universe. On this record, as was not that unusual for him, he manages to create a very contemporary 70s sound while still producing music which is recognizable to fans of his work with Miles Davis 10 years before. This record also features him playing the piccolo bass, which is not a separate instrument, but a regular double bass strung with thinner strings an octave higher, E, A, D, G, just like the first four strings of a guitar. The piccolo bass is not entirely uncontroversial amongst Ron Carter fans, but it does add an extra element to a record already chock full of virtuoso talent, and what results is one of the strongest solo records that Ron Carter ever produced. It's amazing to think that I haven't actually profiled Ron Carter in his own right on this channel so far, but there we go. He was born 87 years ago, or a little bit shy thereof, in Ferndale, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. His earliest interests were not actually in jazz, but in classical music, and he began on the cello, and his talents there took him to that great breeding ground for so much Detroit musical talent, jazz and otherwise, Cass Technical High School. Despite his proficiency on the instrument, he began to notice that he was not getting picked for performances and that white students who may not actually have played as well as him were getting chosen ahead. So, making the best of a terrible situation, as people often had to do, he noticed that the only bass player in the orchestra was about to graduate, so he switched to bass, which assured him regular performance time. In 1955, he graduates from high school and he moves to upstate New York to Rochester to go to the Eastman School of Music, but unfortunately there he suffers another racist rebuff. The guest conductor at the school one year was Leopold Stokowski, who had done the music for Fantasia for Disney, but also was the conductor for the Houston Symphony. He told Carter he would love to take him to the symphony, but Texans would not accept a black person in the orchestra, so again he got passed over. Faced with this discrimination, Carter felt he was at a crossroads, and so, like so many black musicians in the middle part of the 20th century, like Nina Simone, like Billy Strayhorn, like Hubert Laws, as the classical music door closed, Carter found his way to jazz. Instead of the Houston Symphony, he begins playing in Rochester at the Ridgecrest Inn, backing up touring musicians who came through town, many of whom noticed his obvious talent on bass. These musicians regularly encouraged him to move to New York, which he did upon finishing his degree in 1959. In New York, he first found work with Chico Hamilton, not too shabby, and he also pursued a master's degree, which he finished in 1961. In Hamilton's group, he befriends the great saxophonist and multi-instrumentalist, really, Eric Dolphy, and together they make three records which were really on the cutting edge, including Carter's own debut, Where, which featured the piano player Mal Waldron, and Eric Dolphy's Out There and Far Cry. Of course, Carter himself is also a multi-instrumentalist, and on the first two of those, he played cello while George Duvivier played bass. Carter's appeal as a musician, but also as a very solid personality and just a decent human being, really helped him make inroads in the New York jazz scene in the early 1960s. He didn't stick with Hamilton for long, but played with a wide range of players. And it speaks volumes about Carter's character that just 4 years after being told that classical music basically had no place for him because of his skin color, he is playing and in many cases recording with some of the greatest musicians of the 20th century. Some of the fine records that he appears on in the first 2 years of that decade include Kai Winding's debut for Impulse, Bobby Timmons' debut in Person, Randy Weston's Uhuru Africa, Booker Little's Out Front, and Mal Waldron's great record, The Quest. Tremendous records all, and such a range of styles, but Carter just sails through, and you don't get to be the most recorded jazz bassist in history without being adaptable and reliable. And so in a few short years, he establishes himself as essentially the first call bassist in New York for decades to come. In April 1963, Ron Carter had a short-term engagement with Art Farmer at the Half Note when Miles Davis walks into the club. Miles comes up at the intermission and approaches Ron and says, "Look, I want you to join my band." Carter didn't accept right away, somewhat to Miles' surprise because of the difference in stature between the two players. He said, "No, look, I've got an engagement with Farmer for the next few weeks. You're going to have to talk to Art." So Miles goes over, talks to Art. Farmer was not going to stand in the way of Carter. He knew what kind of an opportunity this was. And so Ron Carter becomes the first of Miles's new great quintet to join in the early part of 1963. He's followed that spring by young guns Herbie Hancock on piano and the very young Tony Williams on drums at age 17. And then after about a year's courtship, Wayne Shorter on tenor sax. And so by the summer of 1964, the second great quintet is complete. Carter stays until 1968. His contribution to that quintet is probably best left for other videos, but suffice it to say that alongside the great creative talents of Davis and Shorter and Hancock, Carter, who himself is a composer of no small repute and a great creative force himself, didn't really play that role in that quintet. He was very much kind of an adaptive and stabilizing influence, at least according to his bandmates. Anyway, stays until 1968, lots of great records. Also is a sideman on a whole bunch of great Blue Notes by his colleagues in the band and by lots of other people at Blue Note, like Freddie Hubbard and McCoy Tyner and Lee Morgan, and effectively leaves on his own terms in 1968. Probably a good time to leave. He wanted to spend more time at home with his family. Miles also, he could sense, was moving in different directions. And I think his move is quite timely because although Miles gets a lot of credit or blame for the direction that jazz moved between the late 60s and the early 1970s, somebody else I think who deserves a lot of the credit, blame, responsibility is Creed Taylor at CTI, at least in terms of how the 70s ended up sounding. And it's with CTI that Ron Carter does a whole bunch of great work between the late 60s and the mid to late 1970s. He records extensively for them, more as a studio musician than as a leader. He forms part of what was the informal house band at CTI, along with people like Bob James and Eric Gale and Grover Washington Jr. And in this period, he spreads his wings musically and stylistically. He plays at a whole bunch of pop records for instance, Aretha Franklin and Roberta Flack, big hits. He picks up the electric bass for a period of time, and he also starts to play around with the piccolo bass, as I mentioned. And it's really at the peak of his time with CTI in 1973 that he goes into the studio to make this record. This record is made October 24th, 1973 at Rudy Van Gilder's studio with Creed Taylor producing. Ron Carter is on the bass, he's on the piccolo bass. Now, as I mentioned, that had to be overdubbed, might seem a bit sacrilegious given the live recording tradition of jazz, but I guess if you're Ron Carter, you have no apologies to make. Roland Hanna, who had been playing with Thad Jones, also a Detroit native, and he is fantastic on here. Richard T., a keyboardist who is probably better known for soul and pop records, thus probably a great session guy for CTI, is on the electric piano on one track, 117 Special. Joe Henderson is wonderful on the tenor sax, and behind the kit is the irrepressible Billy Cobham. Side one starts with A Feeling, which is kind of a busy 1970s jazz track, if you know what I mean. By some distance, the most discordant track on the record, not really representative of what's to come, the rest of it. I don't really care for this track as much as the rest of the album. The next track is Light Blue, which is beautiful. It's a real showpiece for Roland Hanna. The last track on side one is 117 Special. If you've seen the recent documentary on Ron Carter, you'll know that this is a track that he associates, in his own imagination anyway, with the Underground Railroad. Side two starts with Rufus, which has this nice little sort of semi-contrapuntal section between Hanna and Carter before they flip the switch and really start to swing. Henderson is terrific on here, as he is on the next track, which is a reboot of Miles Davis's All Blues from his Kinda Blue record, kind of given a slightly funkier 70s makeover. Carter again is overdubbed on the piccolo bass, as he is on the last track, which is a solo venture, Will You Still Be Mine? This is a very technical solo. It's well executed. It's typically rhythmic. I've got to say it's never moved me that much. I think there are some much greater moments for Carter on this record when he's in an ensemble setting. This is one of Ron Carter's best solo records, of which I think there are something like 13 in the 1970s alone, including a bunch for CTI. The piccolo bass gets some online disapproval, but I actually think it adds flair and it's a nice counterpoint to the work of Henderson and Hanna. If you get this record, don't assume that the opening track is too indicative of the rest of the record. It's not. And to me, it hits the sweet spot between his modal jazz heritage and the smoother, funkier sounds of the label for whom he's recording these tracks. It is a great record for bass aficionados. It's a great record for Ron Carter fans. It's one of the strongest entries in the CTI catalog, and for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.